Hey guys, tonight we're sinking deep into velvet-lined rooms, gilt mirrors reflecting candlelight, and the soft, unsettling hum of a harpsichord in the background. You're standing in an 18th-century salon, powdered wig slightly askew, staring blankly at a game of whist that has dragged on since lunch. You're full of duck pâté, stifled yawns, and vague existential dread. The war's out there, sure, but this? This right here? This is worse. And you probably won't know this, but back in the 1700s, boredom wasn't just a passing feeling. For nobles, it was a creeping monster that could corrode the soul, tear apart the mind, and, scandalously, flatten one's social standing. Death by ennui? Not a metaphor, darling. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing where these sleepy journeys reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the marbled corridors of Versailles, perfume-soaked and sleep-deprived, not from stress but from the crushing sameness of every day. You pass mirrors taller than people, rooms too lavish to sit in, and people who spend more energy pretending to enjoy things than actually enjoying them. Welcome to the world of the bored elite, where having everything often means feeling nothing. Historians agree that the 18th century nobility dreaded boredom not merely as discomfort, but as decay. It was whispered about at balls, disguised in polite euphemisms at court, and considered a moral failing if it lasted too long. You were meant to be charming, entertaining, not splayed on a chaise longue staring at the wallpaper like it owed you money. What makes this period so fascinating is how socially lethal boredom was. Imagine being the duke of something you'll forget. If someone saw you languishing too often, not only were you pitted, but suspected, of depression, of moral weakness, even of potential madness. It was a time when public image wasn't curated through Instagram filters but through salon conversation, fashion choices, and how convincingly you could pretend that yet another dinner party hadn't turned your brain into marzipan. Now, psychologists today define boredom as the unpleasant state of wanting to be engaged in something, but being unable to. But for the nobles of the 1700s, it went further. Boredom was a form of spiritual corrosion. It suggested you lacked purpose. And purpose was the one thing no tailor could stitch into your frock coat. Picture this: a nobleman stands by the window for hours, not watching anything in particular. His hand rests limply on a gold-tipped cane. Servants pass, glancing sideways. Is he in mourning? Is he ill? No, dear listener, he's simply bored. But in the eyes of the time, he might as well be halfway to madness. Philosophers still argue whether boredom is a symptom of privilege or a side effect of consciousness itself. Is it nature or nurture that makes a human crave stimulation? The 18th century elite didn't know, but they sure spent a lot of time trying to outpace the feeling. That's part of what makes this era so rich with irony. You've got the richest people in Europe, ensconced in palaces, surrounded by beauty, luxury, music, and court jesters, and yet they're shuffling their feet like teenagers waiting for the Wi-Fi to come back. Now here's a curious tidbit. In 1781, the Countess of Albemarle reportedly hosted a party where the entertainment included watching a tortoise slowly cross the ballroom floor. It was described in a diary as deliciously tranquil. You almost want to believe it was satire, but no, these folks were so starved for new experiences that even turtle pacing qualified as high art. So why does boredom cut so deep here? Well, it's partly because they didn't work. In a society where labor was considered unfit for nobility, time stretched out endlessly like overcooked spaghetti. Modern psychologists studying chronic boredom in retirees and ultra-wealthy heirs note similar patterns. The brain begins to atrophy emotionally without purpose, even if the environment is comfortable. And while today you might scroll TikTok until your brain tingles, nobles had to rely on elaborate rituals, long dinners, and the endless churn of gossip to keep themselves sane. There's also this idea, common in modern psychological research, that boredom intensifies when we lack autonomy. You don't choose what to do, you're just stuck. The nobles were trapped in roles. Appear here. What's fascinating is how this dread of boredom echoes in today's world. Ever check your phone while watching Netflix? That's modern ennui, darling, just with brighter screens. And yet, the nobles had a point. Modern research shows that persistent boredom can be tied to increased risk of depression, impulsivity, and even cardiovascular stress. A 2009 study tracked civil servants over several decades and found that those who reported frequent boredom were more likely to die younger. Who knew dullness could be deadly? So you see, behind the powdered wigs and the marzipan pyramids, there was fear, a deep, lingering fear that boredom could rot the soul. And as we drift into the next room, you begin to understand why doctors started treating it like a disease. You step softly into a pale green drawing room, the walls padded in silk and the air tinged with rosewater. A woman reclines on a divan, wrist draped dramatically over her forehead, eyes half-lidded not in sleep, but in ennui. You've entered the realm of medicalized boredom. Yes, believe it or not, doctors in the 18th century took boredom seriously. Especially if you were rich, pale, and ideally female. The diagnosis? Spleen, nervous melancholy, or, if they were feeling fancy, vapors. Your treatment options? Smelling salts, leeches, or long, soul-depleting walks through foggy gardens with a nursemaid reading aloud from a devotional manual. This wasn't just casual daydreaming misinterpreted by uptight physicians. For the nobility, and especially noble women, boredom was a full-body experience, a condition that supposedly disrupted digestion, complexion, and even fertility. Physicians reported cases of nervous collapse caused by prolonged inactivity. In today's terms, it would be like going to the doctor and being prescribed aromatherapy and fainting lessons because you're bored at brunch. Still, some medical men truly believed boredom could kill. Dr. George Shane, a respected 18th-century physician, wrote that overindulgence, idleness, and melancholy humors of the idle class led to real physical deterioration. He wasn't entirely wrong. Modern psychosomatic research confirms that emotional stagnation can manifest as illness. But in Shane's time, the solution wasn't mindfulness meditation or even a better work-life balance. It was purging. You'd be bled, bathed in cold water, and subjected to herbal tonics so bitter they might actually make you wish for death, if only to skip the next dose. The gender dynamic here is glaring. While noblemen had the fox hunt, politics, and duels to distract them, noble women were often confined to embroidery, letter writing, and a very stifling form of being good company. And when that got old, which it inevitably did, they turned to the only avenue that wouldn't get them exiled or married off again: illness. Some scholars argue that noble women faked sickness to escape their social obligations. Others counter that they felt sick because those obligations were so profoundly unnatural. You try smiling through your 15th recitation of French verse while some powdered uncle critiques your posture. It's either faint or fling your wig at someone. Philosophers still argue whether the boredom epidemic among aristocratic women was socially constructed or biologically emergent. But regardless of origin, it was widely accepted that too much leisure created imbalance, and this imbalance had to be corrected. Harshly. Imagine being punished for the side effect of a lifestyle you never even chose. One peculiar case comes from Lady Arabella Thrumpstone, yes, that was her actual name, who reportedly suffered from an affliction she described as feeling as though trapped in a glass cage of yawns. Her physician's prescription? Fewer novels, more horseback riding, and abstinence from music for 3 weeks. A musical detox. A sonic quarantine. Because apparently Vivaldi was the gateway drug to emotional collapse. And lest you think this was all frivolous melodrama, there were actual institutions that accepted upper-class patients for boredom-based illnesses. You'd be housed in spa towns like Bath or Cheltenham, taking mineral waters, walking slow laps through misty colonnades, and perhaps having your humors rebalanced. In modern terms, it's sort of like sending someone to a wellness retreat when they're just sick of their husband's anecdotes. One contemporary quirk that survives to this day? The rest cure. Originally prescribed to women overwhelmed by ennui, it involved seclusion, enforced stillness, and silence, basically putting the patient in sensory jail. Interestingly, similar practices are used today in extreme digital detox retreats, where overstimulated executives are made to surrender their phones and sit quietly with their thoughts for hours on end. Back then, it was meant to restore a lady's nerves. Today, it costs $5,000 and comes with a vegan meal plan. Now let's pivot, lightly, slowly, to something that's a little weirder. In one London medical diary from 1774, there's mention of a young noblewoman who claimed her boredom caused her to hallucinate a talking silver bowl that begged her to host more dinner parties. The physician suggested this wasn't madness, but a sign of luxury-induced disassociation. A kind of delusion born from overstimulation and isolation. Which, when you think about it, sounds suspiciously like some Reddit threads about people hearing their Alexa talk back after too much screen time. Modern studies support the idea that boredom can lead to dissociative states. One 2012 experiment found that subjects left in a room with no stimuli for just 15 minutes began reporting phantom sounds, flickers at the edge of vision, and a strong urge to do anything, even administer electric shocks to themselves. It's called boredom-induced self-stimulation, and no, not the fun kind. It's the psychological equivalent of poking your own brain with a stick just to feel something. So now picture yourself as Lady Arabella, locked in a house that smells like beeswax and lilacs, no social media, no spicy gossip, and absolutely no outlet for your mind. Your brain does what brains do when trapped, it invents drama. Sometimes, that takes the shape of elaborate imaginary illnesses. Sometimes, it's poetry. And sometimes, it's throwing a teacup at the maid just to see what chaos feels like. This was the age of polite pathology, where emotions had to sneak out through fainting spells, hypochondria, and mysteriously timed migraines. If you can't scream, you swoon. And if you can't protest, you pretend to be unwell and vanish for a week. One last twist, the idea that boredom could be cured by the right moral outlook was pushed by some Enlightenment thinkers. They believed that if you were bored, it meant your soul was untrained, your discipline lacking. If only you had better self-control, you'd be grateful for long afternoons doing nothing. A sort of prototoxic positivity, if you will. Smile harder, dear. The boredom is all in your head. But what these thinkers missed, then and now, is that boredom isn't a failure. It's a signal. Something inside is misaligned, underfed, or trapped. And while the nobles of the 18th century may have lacked vocabulary for it, they felt it deeply. In their bones, their journals, their physicians' bills. And so they fainted, they wept, they swallowed bark tinctures and blamed their livers. But what they really needed was something far simpler. Something you might even find, with a bit of effort, in the next room. You step into a colder chamber now, polished stone underfoot, high ceilings designed to echo whispers of status, and the unmistakable scent of old muskets polished for show more than for use. Here, amid polished sabers and velvet hunting cloaks, lies a curious truth: some nobles feared boredom so much, they'd rather march into cannon fire than sit through another uneventful week. Imagine that. You, bored on a rainy Tuesday, might browse new tea flavors or doomscroll until your thumbs give out. But the 18th century nobleman? He'd lace up his boots, slap on a plumed hat, and ride off to fight a war he didn't believe in. Not because he had to. Because he was bored. This wasn't just occasional. Letters from the era are littered with comments like, "The campaign shall be most diverting," and "Thank heavens, something to do." War offered structure, adrenaline, status, everything idle salons did not. In fact, nobles often romanticized violence as the ultimate palate cleanser. You'd see the same men who dozed off during poetry readings suddenly become wide-eyed and energized when discussing strategies to storm a fort. Psychologically, it makes a bizarre kind of sense. Boredom, as modern studies reveal, can push people toward risk. A 2014 paper in the journal Motivation and Emotion found that people deprived of stimulation, even for short bursts, tended to seek novelty through reckless or impulsive behaviors. Boredom, in essence, short-circuits your brain's reward system. Suddenly, anything is better than nothing. Philosophers still argue whether the pursuit of war was patriotic or pathological. But we can't ignore how many men of that era practically leapt at the chance to enlist. A duel? Delightful. A colonial campaign? Even better. At least it had new smells, new uniforms, and an outside chance of losing a toe for your country. And for those not keen on actual warfare, there were plenty of other options: sporting duels, violent fencing matches, and fox hunts so aggressive they bordered on combat. Some nobles held weekly brawls disguised as friendly contests. Just imagine turning boredom into bloodsport. There's something both comical and tragic in that. One fringe case? Count Albrecht von Schnitzenberg, yes, the name is real, and yes, it does sound like a dessert, who staged elaborate backyard sieges of his own estate. He'd pay local actors to dress as invading brigands, and he and his friends would defend their garden with wooden swords and cannon sound effects. To his peers, it was charming eccentricity. To modern psychologists, it screams sensory deprivation meltdown. The irony is layered. Here were people who had everything: money, prestige, options, yet still engineered chaos just to feel alert. It echoes our own strange modern compulsion to click into controversy, stir online arguments, or chase drama when our minds get too quiet. The need for narrative, even if it's a self-destructive one, is timeless. Another telling example comes from the memoirs of a French nobleman who admitted to joining a naval expedition not for the glory, nor the spoils, but for the salt wind and the blessed absence of idle chatter. You know the boredom is terminal when cannonballs feel like relief. There's also the issue of control. In a tightly curated world of etiquette, where every word and gesture was a performance, the battlefield offered unpredictability. Messy, painful, sometimes fatal, but real. In the context of constant emotional masking, even a broken arm was a kind of honesty. You couldn't fake shrapnel. Modern psychologists have explored the concept of escape from self as a motive for risky behavior. When the present moment is unbearable, when the stillness becomes oppressive, people will leap at whatever promises intensity. And for 18th century nobles, war was intensity on a silver platter. Let's not forget the fashion of it all. A polished saber. A dramatically bloodied cravat. Even a limp could be turned into a romantic detail. Artists of the period painted wounded officers with reverence, even glamour. There was an aesthetic to danger, a perfume of pain that mingled seductively with the rot of ennui. Of course, none of this made the violence less real. But the fact that noblemen sometimes sought it out under the guise of honor reveals just how corrosive boredom had become. And not just corrosive, but shameful. To admit boredom was to confess weakness. So better to mask it under a noble cause, something that wouldn't raise eyebrows. And here's a strange but true aside: some aristocrats purposely lost money gambling, just for the emotional roller coaster of financial ruin. One earl reportedly bankrupted himself 3 times in 12 years, each time saying, "I rather enjoy rebuilding." Either he had very strange taste, or he simply couldn't stand the static hum of contentment. Even hunting wasn't safe from escalation. In Austria, a trend emerged among young nobles who hunted each other with paint-tipped arrows in maze-like gardens. Think laser tag, but with powdered wigs and a weird amount of pre-duel poetry. The need for stimulation, no matter the cost, is a core part of the human brain. And when everything is too easy, too polished, and too routine, that part starts screaming. Boredom, modern science suggests, triggers our brain's default mode network, the mental idling system, which leads to internal storytelling, memory wandering, and, sometimes, existential panic. For the nobles, with entire days unstructured and nothing left to achieve, that panic became a permanent roommate. And yet, it's not just the danger they chased. It was also aliveness. In letters, journals, and confessions, aristocrats describe a kind of emotional numbness that only lifted during chaos. The charge of a cavalry. The snap of a pistol duel. The screaming silence of waiting in a trench. What they feared wasn't death. It was the gray fog of hours that meant nothing. And so, your velvet-slippered ancestor mounted a horse and rode toward musket fire, not because he was brave, but because he was bored out of his powdered skull. The doors creak shut behind you as you enter a narrower corridor, lit by weak sunlight slipping through dust-streaked windows. The air here is still, and you can almost hear the sighs of forgotten nobility echoing off the walls. This was not the wing for dancing or debates. This was the wing where people went when the boredom had begun to bite hard. We're now deep inside the 18th century asylum. Not the horror show of later centuries, but the early version, quiet country estates converted into rest homes for the wealthy who had, quite literally, lost their grip on the plot. And the diagnosis that shows up, again and again, in faded medical ledgers? Moral insanity. This peculiar term was less about criminality and more about, well, becoming weird. Not violently dangerous, just off. Too melancholic. Too giggly. Talking to walls. Refusing to dress properly. Or, as one case file elegantly puts it, permanently afflicted by dreariness. In other words, bored stiff, then softly unhinged. Some modern researchers think we're looking at early cases of depression, anxiety, or even ADHD, misunderstood and mislabeled. But back then, the prevailing theory was that too much leisure unmoored the soul. That without purpose, the psyche drifted, like a hot air balloon slowly losing altitude until it snagged on a tree. One famous case involves Lord Belgrave, who began insisting his furniture was whispering about him behind his back. No violence, no outbursts, just days of quiet paranoia and nights spent rearranging chairs. When his family finally admitted him to an institution, the only recorded cause was excessive time without use. That phrase. It sticks. Today, we call it understimulation. And it's a real thing. Modern psychology tells us that when the brain is denied novelty or challenge, it can begin to invent stimuli, sometimes useful, daydreams, ideas, and sometimes not, compulsions, obsessions, intrusive thoughts. It's the same system that lights up when you're stuck in traffic and suddenly convinced everyone secretly hates you. The 18th century elite lived in a kind of luxurious deprivation. No real work. No fresh problems to solve. No unpredictability. It's like a 5-star hotel you can never leave, where the croissants are perfect every day, but the doors are locked. Eventually, something inside you rattles loose. French psychiatrists of the time had their own theories. One insisted that moral insanity came from soul heat turned inward. Another blamed excess satin. You laugh, but too much time rubbing against opulence might well chafe the brain. These theories may seem absurd now, but they were desperate attempts to explain why people with everything could still unravel like cheap embroidery. Philosophers still argue whether the mind needs friction to stay sane. Without struggle, without puzzles to solve or stakes to raise, perhaps consciousness collapses into itself. This was precisely the fear of the age, that boredom, left unchecked, could rot your faculties. Not just emotionally, but spiritually. And for women, the descent was often faster. You see, noble women were denied even the illusion of agency. No duels. No war. No real travel. Their lives were ceremonies, dressing, sitting, sipping, smiling. If a man could go mad from lack of purpose, imagine the woman who couldn't even walk alone without scandal. As a result, female patients were overrepresented in early asylums. Many arrived with no clear ailment beyond listlessness or melancholy. Some were barely 30. And the cure? Quiet walks. Less poetry. A ban on fiction. One woman reportedly had her Shakespeare taken away for being too emotionally arousing. Imagine being bored and grounded. It would be funny if it weren't so heartbreaking. One especially haunting case is that of Lady Evangeline March, who began talking to birds, fluently, according to the gardener. She believed they were reincarnated philosophers offering escape from her daily routine. Her family, horrified by her insistence on feeding them from the best china, sent her away. Her chart reads, detachment from consensus reality due to extended solitude. In modern terms, chronic boredom-induced psychosis. There's a subtle cruelty to it all. These were not broken people to begin with. They were just unchallenged. Unneeded. unheard, and eventually, unable to bear the weightless drift of their own existence. What's worse, many of these individuals knew what was happening. In letters recovered from estate archives, you find phrases like "my mind grows dull from idleness," or "I fear the days stretch longer than I can endure." One nobleman even wrote, "The hours are not kind. They pass without meaning, and still I must greet them as if they were guests." You'd think with so much fear around boredom-induced madness, society would have changed. But no. Instead of reshaping life to be more meaningful, the upper classes built more distractions: salons, masquerades, lawn games. Anything to dodge silence. Anything to avoid the mirror. And yet, we're not that different now. The modern world is filled with microversions of moral insanity. Doom scrolling, compulsive texting, opening the fridge just to stare into it like it's a portal. The behaviors change, but the root remains. The fear of stillness. The gnawing discomfort of doing nothing and being alone with yourself. One 2020 study observed that people left alone without a phone, book, or task for just 15 minutes reported strong physical restlessness, while a full 67% of participants said they'd rather do something unpleasant than nothing at all. One participant chose to eat a raw lemon. Another recited every ex they'd ever had aloud to a confused intern. We're hardwired for engagement. But engagement doesn't always mean meaning. That was the trap the nobles fell into. And it's one we still dangle our toes into daily. So, as you step out of this corridor of quiet unraveling, take a breath. Let it out slowly. Because in the next room, the bored minds are busy. And they've decided that if stillness is poison, then motion, any motion, must be the cure. You walk into a circular chamber now, walls lined with clocks, each ticking slightly out of sync. The furniture is angular, uncomfortable on purpose. A crystal inkwell sits untouched beside a stack of correspondence, sealed and unread. Welcome to the era when the nobility declared war on boredom by inventing busyness. Not productivity, mind you. Just sheer, frantic occupation. If the 18th century elite couldn't find meaning, they would settle for momentum. This was when being engaged became its own social currency, proof you weren't just sitting around getting quietly devoured by your own mind. Picture yourself as the Marquis of Ennui Ton. You've already rearranged your parlor 3 times this week. You've reread your Greek tragedies and argued about the nature of beauty over 4 consecutive dinners. And so you decide, quite grandly, to establish a philosophical salon. Not because you need to discuss Kant, but because it gives your life the structure of needing to discuss Kant. And soon, everyone's doing it. Founding clubs. Hosting committees. Penning excessively long letters with words like shall and inasmuch. Because doing nothing is suspicious. But appearing extremely, visibly, mentally engaged? That is fashionable. Modern psychology recognizes this as pseudo-meaningful busyness, where people replace genuine fulfillment with constant motion. A 2016 study in psychological science found that people would rather be busy doing nothing useful than idle with time to reflect. It's called idleness aversion, and guess what? The nobles got there first. The explosion of correspondence during this time is a perfect example. Letters between aristocrats weren't just communication, they were performances. Each missive a small theatrical production of wit, gossip, and self-importance. I remain ever consumed by the reading of Voltaire, whose pen, though unseasonably shrill this season, does rattle the mind delightfully, that sort of thing. Hundreds of pages. Daily. It's the 18th century version of replying to emails just to feel alive. Philosophers still argue whether this kind of social busyness enriched culture or simply distracted it. Yes, all those salons and literary circles helped birth new ideas. But they also served as a mask, something to do instead of confronting how hollow life felt beneath the powdered wigs and decorative waistcoats. There's also the strange case of intellectual fads. Much like today's cycles of pop philosophy and hot takes, nobles latched onto whatever was trending: phrenology, mesmerism, spontaneous combustion. 1 month, it was all about Rousseau. The next, everyone pretended to care about how tulips affected human passion. One noblewoman, the Countess of Delamere, reportedly carried around a copy of The Sorrows of Young Werther and would theatrically sigh while reading it in public, by accident. Her diary later revealed she'd never read past the 4th page. But it didn't matter. What mattered was being seen to be interested. Which brings us to perhaps the strangest pastime of all, collecting interests. Nobles began curating lists of books they planned to read, languages they might learn, instruments they could one day play. These were rarely pursued seriously. But the list itself? That was the prize. You could talk about it at parties, sigh over your ambitious schedule, and exude the perfect air of cultured fatigue. In other words, they had to perform purpose. Just like you, maybe, when you tell people you're so busy right now, but can't remember what exactly you've been doing all day. Human nature doesn't change, it just upgrades the furniture. The salons themselves became stages for this psychological theater. Held in tastefully overdecorated rooms with just the right number of exotic plants and harpsichord players, these gatherings were designed less for conversation and more for impression. Everyone had a persona. The stoic. The skeptic. The secret poet who doesn't like to read his work, but totally will if asked twice. You couldn't just be interesting. You had to curate it. And all this busyness was infectious. Nobles started scheduling things just to have schedules. A duke might have 15 appointments in one day, each lasting exactly 17 minutes. One countess reportedly had a clock built with 10-minute chimes, so her guests would never overstay their conversational welcome. Precision became a coping mechanism. Why? Because the ticking clock filled the silence. The planned debate over Voltaire filled the absence of actual emotional connection. The endless invitations, events, and newsletters meant you didn't have to ask the scariest question of all: is this really how I want to live? It's what psychologists today call structured avoidance, where you use structure not to accomplish something, but to protect yourself from existential discomfort. Sound familiar? In one study, researchers observed that people engaged in purposeful busyness showed lower life satisfaction than those who balanced work with meaningful rest. Too much mental clutter, it turns out, keeps you from doing the real inner work. But the 18th century elite couldn't know that. All they knew was that stopping felt like drowning. Let's not forget the rise of the literary poser, a now forgotten but once scorned figure who quoted books he hadn't read and feigned opinions to blend into whatever social crowd he found himself in. Today, we call this Twitter. Still, it wasn't all shallow performance. Some nobles did stumble into genuine curiosity. An aristocrat who started studying botany to kill time might fall in love with taxonomy. A bored baroness, sick of embroidery, could start hosting science nights and end up helping map lunar phases. So busyness wasn't all bad, it just started as camouflage. The deeper issue wasn't the salons or letters or impromptu flute recitals. It was the why. The desperate, unspoken why behind every new club or overly ambitious hobby. They weren't building a meaningful life, they were building a barricade against stillness. And here's the kicker: this legacy never really ended. Today's endless to-do lists, overbooked calendars, and obsession with being productive can be traced directly to this era. The fear that if you stop moving, you'll have to sit alone with yourself for long enough to ask, what now? But don't worry. The nobles still had other tricks up their ruffled sleeves. If busyness didn't work, they had more dramatic options lined up. And one of them involved throwing themselves out of hot air balloons. The air changes as you push open the next door, a sudden draft, the crackle of manic energy. You've walked into a gallery of absurd stunts and delicious recklessness. This is where the most bored nobles became adrenaline junkies in silk breeches. Their motto? If busyness didn't save the soul, danger just might. Welcome to the age of high society risk junkies, noblemen and women so starved for stimulation that they began flirting with death, chaos, and scandal, all for the thrill of feeling something again. Your first stop, the gentlemen aeronauts. It's 1783, and you're watching from a champagne-laced picnic as the Montgolfier brothers launch their hot air balloon over Paris. The nobility go wild, not just because it's new, but because it promises elevation, literal and metaphorical. Within months, aristocrats across Europe are commissioning their own balloons, often with no training, no maps, and only a vague understanding of physics. One viscount nearly drifted into the sea. Another claimed to have ascended for the purpose of better understanding divine loneliness. One duke reportedly packed a violin to play midair in case he died. That's how deep the boredom ran. Modern psychologists classify this behavior as sensation-seeking, the intentional pursuit of intense experiences to combat a low arousal threshold. Studies show that those with high boredom susceptibility are more prone to thrill-seeking, impulsive risk-taking, and novelty obsession. The nobles didn't have extreme sports, but they had fencing blindfolded, dueling at dawn, and masquerades where the masks were never removed. Philosophers still argue whether these stunts were desperation or artistry. Were they reaching for beauty, or simply running from nothingness? It's a fine line when you're bungee jumping into the void of existential dread. But it didn't stop with balloons. Some noblemen staged impromptu pirate nights on their own lakes, hiring staff to dress as captives and attacking boats with rubber swords and real cannons loaded with salt. One baron even hosted a siege dinner, where guests had to break through a simulated war trench just to reach the appetizer course. This was not mere eccentricity. This was a slow unraveling, masked in velvet. Take, for example, the Duchess of Wexford, who became infamous for her séances, not the quiet, candlelit kind, but interactive spiritual dramas. She hired actors to play spirits, let guests summon phantom truths about their futures, and once insisted she was possessed by the ghost of a medieval nun with a gambling addiction. And people came back. Because it beat needlepoint. And let's not forget the horse-racing aristocrats, many of whom took to riding bareback at midnight through their estates, often while drinking and reciting Horace. Why? Because galloping through moonlight with a buzz and a few lines of Latin was just thrilling enough to pierce through the static. A favorite fringe case, Lord Eliot of Norfolk, who built a labyrinth in his garden and would challenge guests to escape it while pursued by hired actors playing intellectual demons. Guests were chased by figures representing boredom, ennui, and despair, each with scripted lines. The game ended when someone screamed, or when someone cried. Whichever came first. Modern research supports the idea that when traditional pleasure centers become overstimulated, people require greater extremes to achieve the same dopamine release. That's why the same noble who once wept at a sonata now needed to hear it played from a moving carriage while blindfolded and slightly tipsy. And then there were the clubhouses. Oh yes. Secret societies dedicated solely to absurd dares and dangerous games. The Hellfire Club in England? That wasn't just for political rebellion, it was a boredom management system wrapped in vice and powdered sugar. Reports suggest they drank molten chocolate until they hallucinated, debated theology and drag, and invented mock rituals just to break the numbing grip of etiquette. Some nobles even created false scandals for fun. One baroness accidentally let it slip that she'd married a ghost, prompting weeks of tabloid speculation. When questioned, she replied with a bored smile, "I was tired of only having one truth." This compulsive reinvention of reality mirrors something psychologists now call reality scrambling, when the brain, unchallenged by the ordinary, begins to crave illusion, distortion, or fantasy. We see it today in everything from LARPing to alternate Instagram personas to metaverse hobbies. Back then, it just looked like faking your death for an amusing reveal at next week's salon. And yet, for all the absurdity, there's something deeply human about it. The nobles weren't monsters. They were trapped. Trapped in routines, roles, and social pageantry. And so, they lit little fires under themselves, sometimes literally. In one of the more eccentric examples, the Marquise de Flaneur invented what she called the game of death's glee. Guests spun a wheel. One wedge meant you had to recite bad poetry. Another, to climb into a coffin for 10 minutes. One unlucky wedge required you to drink a forbidden cordial that turned out to be extremely peppery wine. Harmless? Mostly. Deranged? Absolutely. Effective? It kept everyone awake. But the problem with stimulation chasing is that it's a treadmill. The more you seek, the more you need. The thrill wears off. The fog creeps back in. And so you up the ante, until the balloon crashes or the horse ride ends in a broken wrist and a scandal. One psychologist described this as the starvation of novelty in a feast of abundance. The nobles had so much, they couldn't feel it anymore. So they started craving extremes. And you know what? That craving never left us. Today we dive out of planes, binge murder documentaries to relax, or pay to be locked in escape rooms. Different century, same brain chemistry. We fear boredom more than pain. Because at least pain feels like something. So as you step back from the edge of noble madness, remember, it wasn't all silly hats and melodrama. It was a cry. A high-pitched, champagne-soaked cry to be moved. To be shaken out of the velvet quicksand of too much comfort. But now, let's quiet things down. Because in the next room, the danger has passed, and the damage has begun. The next door swings open slowly, revealing a dimly lit study. Dust motes drift lazily through the air like they, too, are trying to stay awake. The room hums with silence, heavy and waiting. And in the center, a nobleman sits in an overstuffed armchair, staring blankly at a wall of books he has no intention of reading. His hand rests limply on a decanter of wine. Not drinking. Just touching. As though contact alone might spark a feeling. This is where the thrill fades. The stunts have stopped. The guests have gone home. And boredom, no longer masked by activity, begins to rot the foundation. Tonight, we look at what boredom does to the brain, and why your mind might actually fear the quiet more than it fears chaos. Modern neuroscience tells us that boredom isn't just an emotion, it's a stressor. When you're bored, the brain doesn't go into rest mode. It itches. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part of your brain involved in error detection and conflict monitoring, lights up like it's been handed a puzzle it knows it should solve, but can't. You're alert and miserable. A cocktail of low stimulation and high agitation. Sound familiar? It's why long meetings feel longer than traffic jams. It's why you'll eat chips you don't want, scroll posts you hate, or start arguments you regret, just to dodge the howling vacuum of nothing to do. And for the 18th century nobility, the problem wasn't occasional boredom. It was the chronic kind. The soul-sucking, permanent ache of purposeless time. Remember, these were people born into privilege, trained to avoid labor, and forbidden from expressing true feeling. They couldn't work. They couldn't wander. They couldn't weep in public without raising concern. So the stillness? It became terrifying. One fringe report from a physician in 1792 describes a baron who couldn't sleep unless two musicians played soft duets outside his door. Not because he liked music, but because the silence made his ears whisper cruel things. Today, we'd call that auditory hallucination under stress. Back then, they just called it nerves. Philosophers still argue whether silence is inherently healing or if it only heals the already balanced. For minds untrained in self-reflection, like many nobles, raised on applause and appearances, silence was a hostile mirror. It showed them the emptiness inside. The psychologist John Eastwood coined the term boredom proneness, referring to those particularly susceptible to restlessness, inattention, and irritability during low-stimulation environments. People like this, yes, possibly like you, aren't lazy. They're hungry. But not for food. For meaningful engagement. And if you've ever felt more anxious after a long lazy Sunday than during a busy workday, you've tasted what those nobles lived every day. Even more chilling? Boredom affects time perception. Studies show that bored people experience time as slower, more stretched, and more painfully noticed. When you're bored, you don't just feel stuck, you feel trapped in slow motion. 1 minute feels like 10. An hour feels like eternity stuffed in a corset. And aristocrats had a lot of hours. Letters from noblemen speak of time as a villain. I feel stalked by the hourglass, wrote one. "The day has corners it should not," penned another. They were hyper-aware of time's passage, but unable to fill it with anything satisfying. So they performed satisfaction. They smiled. They gossiped. They built beautiful libraries and never touched a single book. And underneath that surface, the brain stewed. Restless. Frustrated. Eventually, numb. This is the darker side of chronic boredom, emotional blunting. Modern imaging shows that prolonged understimulation lowers activity in the brain's reward centers. Basically, the more you do nothing, the less even something can feel rewarding. It's why over-vacationing can backfire. You go from "this is nice" to "I feel like a decorative throw pillow in human form." There's a name for this, too: anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. Often linked to depression, yes, but it can also arise from prolonged monotony. Which, for the nobility, was a lifestyle. Now let's get a little quirky. One under-discussed fringe theory from the era claimed that yawning was a sign of the soul gasping for sensation. Yes, really. A priest in 1784 even suggested that frequent yawning was a sign of moral rot and that energetic prayer might stimulate the mind enough to halt it. Sounds silly, until you remember how often you've yawned while bored and thought, "What is wrong with me?" Another bizarre belief, that boredom could be contagious. At large gatherings, if one person grew visibly disengaged, tapping fingers, looking at the ceiling, it was believed to lower the entire room's morale. Like a psychic virus. Some hostesses reportedly hired enthusiasm guests, people paid just to look interested and keep spirits high. Imagine faking enjoyment as a profession. Then again, maybe we're not so different. Today, social media influencers carefully curate lives of constant novelty, not necessarily to live them, but to signal, loudly, "Look how engaged I am. Look how alive." Same game. New gadgets. This desperation for novelty leads us to another strange twist: boredom triggers memory loss. You heard that right. In low engagement environments, the brain creates fewer memory anchors. That's why an uneventful week seems to vanish. The brain files it under forgettable fog. For the nobles, entire months blurred into one another. One countess famously mistook July for October and insisted her birthday had already passed. It hadn't. But how could she know? Nothing ever changed. So what happens when the thrill fades, the music dies down, and your brain starts whispering, "Do something"? And you have nothing left to do? You sit in your chair. You touch the decanter. You watch the fire burn low. And you begin to long for the one thing you never thought you'd crave, a problem. But what if you couldn't have one? What if society made sure you never had to solve, fix, or build anything ever again? Then maybe, just maybe, you'd begin to understand why aristocrats turned even silence into an enemy. But don't worry. The next room holds a different kind of silence. The enforced one, the kind handed to you by a fan, a lace collar, and centuries of etiquette designed to keep you busy doing nothing. You step quietly now, the walls narrowing again, the wallpaper more intricate, almost suffocating in its perfection. The floorboards creak beneath your feet, not from age, but from expectation. You've entered the wing of social graces and whispered rules. Here, silence isn't peaceful, it's prescribed. You're in the gilded cage where noble women waited, smiled, and slowly unraveled. This is the gendered boredom trap. While noblemen had duels, military service, gambling halls, and intellectual debates to stave off the void, noble women had needlepoint. A little music. A supervised walk. A lot of polite nodding. And you, as a noble woman, exist to be pleasing. Your voice is soft. Your posture, perfect. Your opinions? Filtered through the decorum of your governess's corrections. Every day is a rotation of mirrors and men, dress, dine, entertain, and above all, wait. Psychologists today have long confirmed that lack of autonomy intensifies the experience of boredom. One famous 1990s study showed that even when subjects were placed in relatively comfortable settings, if they had no control over their time or actions, their boredom scores shot up. Now imagine an entire lifetime choreographed by someone else, your father, your husband, your chaperone. Philosophers still argue whether noble women's boredom was internalized repression or externally enforced constraint. But honestly, who cares? The result was the same, a suffocating fog of emptiness under the perfume. One countess described her life as being neither alive nor dead, only paused. In theory, these women had everything: dresses hand-stitched by specialists, music lessons from traveling composers, a garden to stroll through when allowed. But these were trinkets. What they lacked was agency. Modern scholars refer to this as decorative confinement, a term borrowed from architectural theory and applied to lives. You weren't imprisoned by walls. You were imprisoned by expectations. Think glass dome. Pretty, well-lit, and entirely inescapable. Even their entertainments were passive. Reading? Yes, but only select titles. Writing? Certainly not novels. Music? As long as it wasn't too expressive. Emotions were allowed in minor keys only. One fringe story tells of a young duchess who tried to keep herself alert by memorizing the shapes of her garden hedges. Every morning she'd assign them names and backstories. Eventually, she believed one of them was in love with her. Her family quietly replaced the gardener. It's easy to laugh. But if you strip away the wigs and fan language, you might recognize this same dull ache in yourself, scrolling apps without absorbing anything, watching shows you've already seen, playing the same playlist not because you love it but because it asks nothing new of you. This kind of boredom, the helpless kind, is psychologically dangerous. A 2003 study linked lack of agency with increased risk for depressive symptoms, especially in structured environments where choices are made for you. Sound familiar? And noble women were prime candidates. They couldn't travel unchaperoned. They couldn't speak freely at most gatherings. Their marriages were contracts, their lives pre-written. And when they dared rebel, even in small ways, they were punished. Lady Eleanor Witt, for instance, once arranged her embroidery into a parody of the royal crest, replacing the lion with a pig. It caused a minor scandal. She was banned from court for irreverent needlework. Her crime? Having a sense of humor. This led many noble women to develop what modern psychology now calls covert rebellion, subtle acts of resistance within constrained systems. Secret letters. Hidden books. Private diaries filled with outrage cloaked in metaphor. Even fashion became a weapon, corsets tightened until fainting, sleeves that narrowed movement, or colors that quietly mocked court protocol. There's even evidence that boredom itself became performative. You were expected to be delicately bored. Not sloppy or petulant. No sighing too loudly. A glazed stare was acceptable. Open yawns were not. Boredom had to be beautiful. One fringe artifact discovered in a noblewoman's writing desk? A boredom diary, a small, velvet-bound book with daily entries like, dined, smiled, listened, stared at blue wallpaper until it moved, tried not to scream. Even their minds turned on themselves. Without stimulation or variety, the brain turns inward, and not always kindly. Rumination increases. Anxieties inflate. You begin to wonder if it's you. Are you broken? Lazy? Ungrateful? Psychologists today recognize this pattern as internalized monotony distress, when the emotional symptoms of boredom, fatigue, irritability, disconnection, are misattributed to personality failings. You feel dull, so you believe you're dull. A psychological snake swallowing its own tail. And in many noble households, that belief was reinforced. Be graceful. Don't fidget. You're lucky to live like this. But luck without liberty is a cruel form of generosity. There's also the eerie phenomenon of shared silence. Noble women often socialized in semi-silence, tea rooms where conversation topics were pre-approved, salons where women were spoken at, not with. It wasn't uncommon to spend 3 hours in a room with others and leave without having said a single original thought. And still, they smiled. A modern equivalent might be those meetings where your mic stays muted, where your ideas stay stuck in your throat because you know they won't land well. You're there, but not there. Present, but erased. Some rebelled, of course. Some wrote under pen names. Some took lovers. Some escaped into long, charity visits that, conveniently, lasted months. And occasionally, a woman broke free completely, renounced her title, fled to the country, and wrote poetry in trousers. These were the exceptions. The celebrated ones. But most stayed. And in their staying, they formed the template for generations of women who learned to endure elegant boredom as a skill. Who believed being bored was a sign of success, not suffocation. The legacy lingers. Today, boredom in women is still treated differently. A woman who seeks adventure is restless. One who leaves a stable but joyless situation is irrational. A bored man is understood to need stimulation. A bored woman? She's often told to be grateful. So as you step through this too-perfect room, trailing your fingers along the edge of a polished writing desk, remember, boredom wasn't always benign. Sometimes it was the slow, satin-wrapped suffocation of a mind that wasn't allowed to stretch. In the next room, though, boredom starts to evolve. It becomes not something to hide, but something to celebrate. With candles, poetry, and just the right amount of faked despair. You pass through heavy curtains now, dark velvet, deep blue. The lighting is dimmer here, deliberately so. You're in a room built for brooding, for sighs and stares. Someone's left a half-finished glass of wine on the piano, and there's a faint scent of burnt wax. A poem lies open on a chaise lounge, next to a black lace glove. No one is here, yet the room feels performed. This is where boredom stopped being a problem and started being a persona. Welcome to the invention of melancholy glamour. It begins, as all trends do, with dissatisfaction. After generations of noble boredom being hidden behind fans, warfare, and embroidery, something strange began to happen. Nobles started leaning into it. They no longer ran from their listlessness. They wore it. You imagine yourself at a salon in 1790. You're dressed in gray. Not because it suits you, but because it doesn't. You sit quietly in the corner, eyes half-lidded, responding to conversation only in verse. Someone asks what you've been up to and you reply, I've been contemplating the futility of joy. Someone swoons. Because now, finally, boredom had gone from shameful to chic. This transformation didn't happen overnight. But as Enlightenment ideals gave way to romanticism, emotions, especially deep, unfixable ones, became fashionable. And what was deeper and more tragically unfixable than existential ennui? Modern psychologists call this emotional rebranding, the act of transforming distressing feelings into valued identity traits. Think of how today's I'm dead inside jokes serve as a kind of cultural armor. In the 18th century, melancholy was your accessory. Just enough sadness to look profound. Not enough to get institutionalized. Philosophers still argue whether this aestheticization of gloom helped nobles cope with their emotional stasis or simply romanticized it beyond repair. Either way, it left its mark. Artists started painting portraits in muted tones, blue shadows, delicate expressions of poetic grief. Nobles posed with books they hadn't read, in front of windows they never opened. Poets wrote lines like, "The day droops like a wilted petal, I, too, refuse to bloom." If it sounds overwrought, it was. That was the point. A fringe anecdote worth savoring, Lady Seraphina von Wexley once hosted a mourning party where no one had died. Guests were instructed to wear black, bring a sad memory, and sit in contemplative silence for 3 hours. The servants called it a funeral for time. The guests called it sublime. This isn't just social theater, it's a full neurological pivot. You see, the brain seeks narrative. When we experience prolonged emotion, like boredom, with no outlet, we assign it meaning. And in the case of 18th century aristocrats, that meaning became, I am deep. I am misunderstood. My boredom is the mark of my intelligence. And honestly? It worked. Suddenly, to be too busy was vulgar. Frantic schedules were gauche. The truly refined cultivated leisure, not just physical, but emotional. You didn't seek entertainment. You waited for it to earn you. You weren't disengaged because you were shallow, you were bored because you had seen too much. This is where the archetype of the elegant sufferer was born. Modern pop culture is still haunted by this figure. The moody protagonist. The brilliant loner. The tragic heroine watching the world from behind smudged eyeliner. It all traces back to salons where people argued whether sighing was a legitimate conversation starter. One psychologist, writing about mood performance, described it as intentional emotional fogging, where a person adopts a low-energy, mysterious persona to signal intelligence, sensitivity, or world weariness. Sound like your favorite indie movie character? Exactly. And the nobles leaned in hard. Some created entire rooms in their homes devoted to melancholic activities, sighing corners, lamentation chairs, spaces with intentionally low lighting for reflective grief. One baron commissioned a harpsichord that could only play in minor keys. He called it the instrument of my discontent. A guest once asked if he played anything lively. He said, only regret. Of course, not everyone approved. Some Enlightenment thinkers warned that glamorizing boredom would dull the mind. One letter from the era scolds a young noble for overindulging in fashionable sadness, like a child who finds sorrow sweeter than jam. But for many, it was already too late. Boredom had become performance art. It even entered courtship. Forget I like long walks on the beach. 18th-century love letters dripped with languid longing. Since I last beheld your gaze, the hours hang like wet linen, useless and gray. That's not desperation. That's flair. You weren't just in love. You were devastated by the mere possibility of love. The ultimate goal? To be tragic enough to be interesting, but not enough to be carted off. This delicate balance is something psychologists today observe in social identity performance. A little sadness signals depth. Too much, and people back away. You must curate your gloom. Just as the nobles did. But here's the twist, behind all this poetic sadness, real depression was likely simmering. Historians believe that many nobles, especially women, suffered undiagnosed mood disorders. But instead of help, they got applause. Oh, she sits in the garden all day reading Byron and weeping into the roses? So cultured. One haunting anecdote, a nobleman was praised for composing a beautiful sonnet about the inevitability of despair. He later admitted it was written during a breakdown, while locked in a dark room refusing to speak for 3 days. His valet framed the poem. No one asked how he was. This is the cost of aestheticized suffering. People stop noticing the pain behind the performance. And yet, something about this phase of noble culture still resonates. The idea that our most private discontents could be turned into art, into image, into armor, it's seductive. We don't want to feel nothing. But if we must feel hollow, let it at least be beautiful. Today, melancholy glamour lives on in moody Instagram filters, curated playlists of sad songs, and the way we romanticize boredom as introvert time or just vibing. The ghost of that noble sigh still drifts through our bedrooms as we stare at ceilings and call it rest. But eventually, even glamour becomes exhausting. The sighs start to feel performative. The mystery becomes a chore. And the soul wants to do more than pose. It wants to act. And that is when boredom stops being a private mood and becomes a political threat. You emerge now into a grand salon, but it's different from the others. The laughter here is brittle, the air sharper, like flint about to spark. Chandeliers gleam a little too brightly. Conversation runs a touch too fast. You can feel the tension coiled behind every smile. This is where boredom stopped being a personal flaw and started being evidence of something rotten. We've arrived at the part where boredom becomes political. To the emerging revolutionaries of the late 18th century, ennui wasn't a harmless mood, it was a symptom of decadence, of moral decay, of a system so bloated and idle it had begun to collapse in on itself. And who was the most bored class of all? The aristocracy. Philosophers still argue whether boredom was a direct cause of revolution or just convenient propaganda. But there's no doubt that the idle rich became an irresistible target. Their yawns were interpreted as insults. Their parties as proof of apathy. Their melancholy glamour? Oh, it might as well have been treason and lace. Revolutionary thinkers latched onto boredom as more than laziness, it became a moral diagnosis. Rousseau accused the elite of having souls empty from too much abundance. Robespierre condemned the nobility's tedium-drenched evenings as symptomatic of a class that contributed nothing and consumed everything. And for the first time in modern history, boredom became dangerous, not to the bored, but to the state. Suddenly, tales of aristocrats building miniature pleasure ships to float in their bathtubs weren't just odd, they were evidence. Every overly complex wig, every 4-hour meal, every poetry contest about sadness, it all painted a picture of a ruling class that had run out of purpose. And revolutions, you see, love purpose. Take the infamous Marie Antoinette. While the story of her saying "let them eat cake" is likely apocryphal, her actual pastime, playing shepherdess in an artificial village at Versailles, became a potent symbol of disconnected leisure. Imagine, the pamphlets smeared, being so bored with excess you cosplay poverty. The court's desire to escape boredom became damning. When nobles sought out absurd amusements, their desperation made them look unfit to rule. When they did nothing, they looked even worse. Modern psychologists would call this a visibility trap. When you're publicly idle and visibly comfortable, your boredom doesn't just reflect your mood, it reflects your values. And the revolutionaries spun that image like wool. One fringe example? Revolutionary newspapers in Paris began running satirical boredom forecasts, mocking noble events like Count H.'s annual philosophical slouching or Madame de S.'s grand sigh-off. It was comedy, but sharp, weaponized comedy. Death by laughter, or at least by public scorn. We see similar tactics today. Political movements still call out elite leisure as a form of injustice. Think of the critiques of billionaire space joyrides, luxury bunkers, or tasteless influencer stunts during global crises. There's an age-old anger behind it. Why do they get to be bored while the rest of us can't afford to be? This anger was especially potent during times of scarcity. Famine in France, inflation, rising unemployment, while salons carried on as usual, now featuring melancholy tasting menus and opera arias about ennui. It wasn't just tone deaf. It was fuel. Revolutionary art leaned in hard. Paintings and plays depicted bored nobles as limp, overfed grotesques surrounded by servants and wine. Even children's books aimed at revolutionary families included villains who snored through justice and drifted into dreams while the people starved. Of course, it wasn't always fair. Not every noble was idle. Some worked hard, invested in art, science, and public welfare. But in politics, perception is everything. And boredom had become a brand, one the upper classes couldn't shake. Even the decor of the elite became suspect. Sumptuous rooms were read not as beauty, but as distraction. What are you hiding behind those gold leaf moldings? A guilty conscience? Or worse, nothing? One satirical poem described a duke as a man who polished his boredom daily until it gleamed like his shoes. It was brutal. And brutally effective. The psychology here is fascinating. When a population is overworked, overstressed, and underfed, boredom among the elite feels like betrayal. In fact, modern studies show that perceived leisure disparity, when one group is seen enjoying free time while another suffers, heightens resentment more than income disparity. It's not just what you have. It's how effortlessly you seem to have it. And nobles? They were the poster children for effortlessness. Some tried to adapt. They gave speeches, hosted charity balls, staged elaborate expressions of sympathy. One duchess famously cried at the unveiling of a bread shortage chart. But the effort fell flat. It's hard to look concerned with a diamond necklace draped across your collarbones. A particularly haunting anecdote: a nobleman, desperate to appear engaged with the people, took to strolling the streets of Paris in simple cloth shoes. He thought it would show humility. The crowd thought he was mocking them. They threw turnips. And then came the guillotine. Of course, not everyone was bored to the same degree. Not every aristocrat lived in decadence. But the culture of cultivated idleness, the performances of languor, the theater of sighs, had branded the class as emotionally hollow. And once boredom is tied to corruption, it's no longer a personal affliction. It becomes evidence of guilt. Today, this still lingers. A celebrity posting a vacation photo during a crisis. A CEO joking about being so bored on a private island. The optics are damning. Because deep down, we know, boredom can't be neutral. Not when it's bought at the cost of someone else's exhaustion. And so, as you leave this room of rising voices and velvet tension, take one last glance at the powdered figures slouching in golden chairs. They're not just bored anymore. They're doomed. In the next room, they'll try to escape. Not through revolt, but through distraction. Through exotic lands, dangerous quests, and fantasies that shimmer with false promise. Because when your world crumbles beneath your feet, the easiest thing to do is run. The air grows warmer now, tinged with spices, unfamiliar wood, and the distant cry of birds that do not belong here. You're no longer in Versailles, or Vienna, or any other powdered enclave of European boredom. You're standing on the edge of an imagined world, vast, wild, and suspiciously curated for noble delight. This is the room where the bored rich left home, and called it discovery. Welcome to the era when curing aristocratic boredom became justification for colonial expansion, class domination, and the commodification of exotic life. Here, your escape from ennui isn't a nap or a book club. It's a grand tour through lands you don't understand, cultures you barely acknowledge, and people you call colorful because you refuse to say real. The Grand Tour, a fashionable rite of passage for wealthy young men in the 18th century, was originally about art, antiquity, and education. But as it grew in popularity, it mutated into something else, a boredom cure dressed as cultural pursuit. One bored baron wrote, "Rome has fine ruins, but I prefer the chaos of Cairo." Another declared, "Florence is instructive, but I crave the spice of the East." Translation, Europe wasn't stimulating enough. They needed lands that smelled different, looked different, and, most importantly, felt different. Modern psychology refers to this as novelty-seeking behavior, where overstimulated individuals require unfamiliar stimuli to activate their pleasure systems. Sound familiar? It's the same impulse that fuels doom-scrolling, thrill-seeking, and, yes, excessive travel influencers. But in the 1700s, this novelty-seeking wasn't just a quirk, it was backed by money, power, and imperial muscle. Bored nobles didn't just visit foreign lands, they imposed themselves upon them. They collected artifacts, commissioned paintings, and wrote travelogues that were equal parts wonder and condescension. Philosophers still argue whether these journeys enriched European thought or simply flattened foreign cultures into exotic wallpaper. One thing is certain, they allowed bored elites to feel alive without fixing anything at home. Take Lady Penelope Ashcroft, who famously described her trip to India as a delicious detour from the tedium of ballrooms. She returned with a tiger cub, 5 rugs, and a vague sense that she had awakened. The locals, notably, were never consulted about their role in this awakening. There was something intoxicating about the other. Foreignness was rebranded as fantasy. And in that fantasy, nobles could project anything they wanted: spiritual renewal, sexual intrigue, adventure without consequence. They could reinvent themselves simply by leaving Europe. It wasn't just about location. It was about status. In aristocratic circles, being well-traveled became shorthand for being cultured. Never mind that your stories were riddled with inaccuracies, your souvenirs purchased from the nearest port market, and your opinions shaped entirely by other bored noblemen. What mattered was the aesthetic of exploration. One fringe case, a viscount who claimed to have reached the outer edge of the Persian world, he had not. He hosted lavish dinner parties themed around fictional desert customs, served saffron in everything, and once entered a ballroom riding a camel. People applauded. Not because they believed him. but because it was something different. There's a name for this kind of behavior in modern scholarship: colonial escapism. When privileged individuals seek stimulation through the consumption of other cultures, often while ignoring the actual people, histories, and complexities behind them. It's not connection, it's decoration. And yet, for the bored nobles of the 18th century, it felt like salvation. Psychologists studying stimulus-deprived enrichment note that individuals in stagnant environments often seek identity transformation through external change, travel, costume, narrative reinvention. For the European elite, the colonies weren't just geopolitical projects. They were mirrors. Blank canvases onto which they could project their longing for meaning. This hunger was insatiable. Soon it wasn't enough to just travel. You had to collect. Trinkets, animals, people. Wealthy homes became museums of conquest. Egyptian statues in French parlors. Turkish Ottomans in London studies. A peacock feather from somewhere that probably wasn't Sri Lanka but who's counting. One noblewoman was known for throwing Oriental evenings, where guests dressed in silks, ate vaguely spiced stews, and listened to servants read translations of poems that may or may not have existed. It was absurd. But it kept the yawns at bay. Here's the darker truth: boredom fueled exploitation. The need for novelty justified violence, displacement, and theft. The logic went, if our world no longer thrills us, we must seek fresh wonder, wherever, however, we can find it. One chilling quote from a letter written by a British aristocrat in 1789, "They are simple folk, not much for conversation, but their lands glisten with possibility." Translation: I am bored, and your home is now mine. This is the legacy of noble boredom, the belief that the world exists to entertain you. That cultures are experiences, not communities. That everything unfamiliar is yours to repaint into something interesting. Even today, you see echoes of this. Digital nomads taking selfies in temples they don't understand. Tourists turning sacred sites into backdrops. Vacation packages promising authentic experiences without a trace of discomfort. We're still chasing stimulation, still dressing up conquest as curiosity. But the nobles? They believed it was progress. Expansion. Enlightenment. They came home with stories and spices, with sunburns and carvings, and a new reason to be seen. Ah yes, I've been to the edge of civilization, they'd say, sipping tea in salons that hadn't changed in 50 years. And when the novelty wore off, they turned their gaze to new frontiers. Deeper Africa. Farther Asia. The Americas. Anywhere the map had white space, they saw possibility, not for trade or diplomacy, but for escape. From what? From their marble halls. Their endless etiquette. Their dinner parties with no surprise. Their boredom. Because no matter how far they went, they always came back to themselves. In the next room, we'll look at what that return felt like. How the mind reacts when stimulation becomes expectation. When luxury becomes a burden. When every distraction loses its shine, and you're left not with wonder, but weariness. You step now into a quiet room that seems, at first, restful. Everything here gleams with restraint, no heavy brocade, no gold-framed portraits. Just polished surfaces, a few elegant books, and a single ticking clock on the mantel. But the longer you stand in it, the more something feels off. It's not peace you feel. It's emptiness wearing a tuxedo. This is the room of restless luxury. Where having everything means feeling nothing. And where modern psychology finally catches up with what the nobles never quite managed to name: hedonic adaptation. That's the term for what happens when pleasure loses its power. The first time you taste caviar, you're curious. Maybe even delighted. The 10th time, it's just another flavor. The brain's reward system is built for novelty, not repetition, and the wealthier you are, the faster you burn through newness. For the 18th century elite, life was an all-you-can-eat buffet of comfort and stimulation. But eventually, that buffet starts tasting like wallpaper. And when you've run out of new things to try, You start noticing the hollowness beneath the shine. Psychologists today have studied this phenomenon extensively. In one study, participants who were consistently exposed to luxury goods, gourmet food, or extravagant experiences reported lower long-term satisfaction than those who received the same pleasure sporadically. Why? Because they stopped registering them as special. It's the same principle that makes your favorite song less moving after the 100th play. The same reason lottery winners often return to their baseline mood within a year. The brain adjusts. And it punishes repetition with numbness. Now imagine being a nobleman in 1785. Your meals are exquisite. Your shoes are custom. Your days are planned by someone else. And yet, when you close your eyes at night, you feel nothing. Not misery. Not fear. Just a blank, velvet-lined fog. Philosophers still argue whether this kind of emotional flattening is a symptom of overindulgence or underuse of the self. Is the problem having too much? Or not being asked to do enough? Either way, the nobles lived in this dilemma. Letters and journals from the time reveal a surprisingly consistent phrase among the elite: "I long to feel needed." It's written by duchesses and dukes alike. Some even envied their staff, not their poverty, but their purpose. To wake up and know you must tend the garden or prepare the linen or ride out at dawn, that, somehow, seemed more real than another salon. One French nobleman, Baron Etienne de Largent, reportedly began sneaking out of his estate at night to work with street sweepers in Paris. He said it helped him smell the world again. He was nearly arrested for vagrancy, then returned to his gilded home, where he wept into a glass of Burgundy. His staff pretended not to notice. Modern psychologists would nod at this. Studies show that meaningful engagement, not luxury, is what drives long-term happiness. Give someone a sense of purpose, and their baseline well-being rises. Give them unstructured indulgence, and it spikes, then crashes. It's not just about wealth. It's about psychological bandwidth. When you're constantly stimulated, lavish parties, rare books, extravagant performances, your threshold for feeling rises. And when normal things no longer excite you, nothing does. A study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people with access to constant entertainment report higher boredom levels during downtime. They've trained their minds to expect fireworks. So silence? Stillness? They feel like failure. This is exactly what plagued the nobles. Their brains had been rewired by opulence. They couldn't go backwards. They couldn't downshift. Even simplicity became a kind of pain. One countess famously tried to reset her senses by spending 3 days in a sparse cabin on her estate. She returned halfway through day 2, complaining that the wind sounded judgmental and the firewood lacked narrative. That's the curse of restless luxury: your expectations climb, but your capacity for pleasure doesn't. Another psychological quirk? Choice fatigue. When everything is available, nothing feels decisive. Nobles had endless options: dresses, tutors, suitors, travel routes, but the freedom to choose became a burden. Some letters describe nobles spending hours deciding how to fill their afternoons, only to choose nothing at all. Paralysis by abundance. This trickles into modern life, too. Think of streaming platforms. Thousands of options. And still, you scroll. You skim. You rewatch something safe. Because too much choice, just like too much luxury, leads to disengagement. One satirical pamphlet from 1790 even described a nobleman who died of indifference. The joke? He was so undecided about which pleasure to pursue that his body gave up while his mind hesitated. He was found clutching a list of operas and a cold lobster. But it wasn't just the choices or the rewards that dulled them. It was the insulation. Nobles were shielded from consequences. Their world was too padded to feel real. Failures were cushioned, successes prearranged. You didn't earn your dinner, you inherited it. And without friction, the soul becomes smooth and slippery. Hard to hold on to. Some tried to escape this numbing insulation by embracing artificial challenge, games, puzzles, fake drama. One count hosted staged family arguments to practice emotional sharpness. Another created an obstacle course in his estate where guests had to solve riddles to exit the ballroom. But even these games eventually dulled. You can only trick your brain for so long. Eventually, what many nobles discovered, quietly, privately, is that the most radical luxury might not be the newest experience, but the oldest one, purpose. Some took up causes. Some turned to religion. Others found solace in philosophy, farming, or quiet service. Not because it was fashionable, but because it offered structure. And in that structure, feeling. But the vast majority? They didn't find their way out. They kept chasing novelty, bumping up against the edges of their overstimulated minds, until even the chase lost its thrill. And so they sat. In quiet rooms with ticking clocks. Surrounded by everything. Longing for anything. In the next room, we'll find out what they left behind for us. Not just wealth or monuments, but a blueprint for modern boredom. One that lives in our phones, our habits, our endless scroll towards something new. The next room isn't grand. It's not even furnished. Just white walls, a flickering candle in the corner, and a small wooden chair in the center. But what makes it unsettling isn't its emptiness, it's the fact that it feels familiar. Because this is your room. Not the gilded halls of the 1700s, not the rose-scented salons or the colonial gardens. This is the quiet place where your boredom lives. The one shaped by centuries of habits passed down from powdered forebears who couldn't sit still. This is where we explore the noble legacy in today's boredom. Spoiler, it's alive and scrolling. Modern life, for all its speed and stimulation, carries the fingerprints of those aristocratic ancestors. The fear of stillness. The performance of busyness. The constant craving for the next thing. Only now, the wigs are gone, the duels are digital, and the ballroom is a glowing rectangle in your hand. Start with the obvious, overstimulation. You, like the nobles, live in a world where novelty is just one tap away. Endless entertainment. Infinite scrolling. All designed to hijack your brain's reward system and keep you in motion. And yet, what do we hear over and over? I'm bored. Psychologists call this the paradox of choice. The more options you have, the less satisfied you are with any of them. Sound familiar? It's not unlike the nobleman pacing between ballrooms, unable to choose which harpsichord solo will least offend his ennui. But it goes deeper than screens. Today's society has absorbed boredom shaming wholesale. Doing nothing is suspicious. Slowness is guilt. If you're not working, optimizing, learning, or monetizing a hobby, what are you even doing? And where did this hustle guilt come from? Trace it back. The Enlightenment told us to use time wisely. The Victorians told us to redeem time. But the nobles? They told us boredom was dangerous, and that we must perform against it. Their rituals became our routines. They threw salons to avoid the silence. We open group chats we don't care about. They curated interests to seem engaged. We fill profiles with hobbies we haven't touched in years. They read books they didn't understand. We quote podcasts we barely finished. The costumes have changed, but the fear of stillness hasn't. One modern study from the Journal of Consumer Psychology revealed that individuals who value constant engagement tend to suffer more when denied it, even for brief periods. The stress responses mirrored mild withdrawal. In short, you can get addicted to avoiding boredom. Just like the nobles were. Even social media itself mimics the salons of the 18th century. Carefully managed images. Clever replies. Trending opinions delivered with just the right level of curated emotion. We don't just share. We perform. And like noble guests trying to seem intrigued by every new aria, we signal interest to avoid looking disengaged. Philosophers still argue whether this is evolution or erosion. Are we adapting to new tools, or just dressing up our old dysfunctions in prettier fonts? One thing's clear, noble boredom is now democratized. You don't need a castle to feel it. Just a Wi-Fi connection. A few too many streaming options. A Sunday with no plans. Even the aesthetics have returned. Sad girl playlists. Indie films with 3 lines of dialogue. Filtered melancholy. The same longing that once filled Velvet Diaries now slips into our DMs. Boredom isn't shameful anymore. It's marketable. But the pain beneath it? Still real. One fringe example, a modern therapy trend called boredom exposure, where patients are guided through controlled periods of intentional, structured nothingness to confront and rewire their discomfort with stillness. A literal reprogramming of the noble mind. Because it turns out, we can unlearn the panic. But we have to look it in the eye. And what do we see when we do? That boredom isn't the enemy. It's the messenger. It tells you something is missing, not outside you, but within. The nobles never really got there. They kept chasing stimulation, rearranging the chairs in their gilded halls, hoping the next arrangement would feel different. You might be doing the same. More tabs. More subscriptions. More ideas to chase and abandon. But maybe what you need isn't more. Maybe you need a chair. A candle. A quiet room. And the courage to just sit. This is the inheritance we never asked for. A blueprint for avoidance passed down through lace and liveried habits. But here's the good news, just because they couldn't stop doesn't mean you can't. Because in the next room, the lights are low. The colors soften. The noise fades. And boredom? It starts to sound a little bit like peace. The hallway curves gently now, as if even the architecture wants you to slow down. Velvet gives way to linen, gold to wood grain. Your footsteps fall softer here, and you can feel the hum of something different, quieter than boredom, deeper than silence. This is the room where the panic ends. The pursuit softens. Where the nobles, once breathless with distraction, begin to wonder if perhaps they were running from the wrong thing all along. Tonight, we land at the edge of a strange thought, that boredom, this thing so feared, fought, and dressed in perfume, might actually be the medicine the mind never let itself taste. You sink into a low chair, one that doesn't demand posture. There's no music playing, no candelabras or hovering servants. Just air. Just space. And the idea, tentative, flickering, that maybe the stillness is not emptiness, but invitation. Modern psychology is finally circling back to something the nobles could never quite reach, that boredom isn't a sign of a broken mind. It's the clearing before insight. The pause before presence. It's what happens when the performance ends and the mind, uncostumed, finally breathes. Studies in recent years have shown remarkable benefits to boredom when embraced intentionally. In 2014, researchers found that subjects asked to engage in mundane tasks, like sorting beans by color or copying long numbers, were more creative afterward than those who were constantly stimulated. Their minds had space to roam. To wander into solutions, ideas, dreams. And yet, the fear persists. The nobles weren't stupid. They knew they were chasing shadows. Many of them wrote as much. I fear that stillness might reveal me, one count confessed in his journal. That I might meet myself there and find no applause. Philosophers still argue whether boredom reveals truth or merely amplifies longing. But one thing is certain, it asks something of you. It doesn't entertain. It doesn't distract. It demands your attention. And attention, untrained, will squirm. Like a spoiled pet. The noble women who stared at walls until the wallpaper moved? Maybe they weren't mad. Maybe they were the first to realize that the mind needs to drift before it lands. That meaning isn't found in motion, but in waiting long enough to notice what was always there. The trick is not to numb yourself with activity, or shame yourself into productivity. The trick is to get bored enough that the noise stops mattering. That the real voice inside can speak clearly. This is why some modern therapies now prescribe boredom, not as punishment, but as practice. Digital detox. Solo walks. Journaling without prompts. You're not trying to produce. You're just making space. space the nobles never allowed themselves. One fringe case, unearthed in a letter never sent, tells of a dowager duchess who left court life and moved to a cottage by the sea. "I do not wake with purpose," she wrote. "I wake. And the sky is blue. And that is enough. I am no longer watched. And I have stopped performing my despair." It's possible the very thing they feared, boredom, was never the enemy. It was the cure they weren't ready to take. The soft medicine of slowness. Even their bodies knew it. The fainting couches. The whispered rituals. The endless baths. Maybe they were all just trying to slow down. To feel something without spectacle. You, too, might be chasing too many suns. Trying to find novelty in noise. But what if you didn't? What if you stopped scrolling? Stopped apologizing for a quiet afternoon? What if you sat in the garden and let the hedges speak? Not with excitement. Not with fireworks. Just with presence. Because boredom, when you stop fearing it, becomes something else entirely. It becomes rest. It becomes return. It becomes the space in which you finally remember how to sleep. And so, now we slow. Let the rooms fade, the salons, the duels, the sighs behind fans. Let the echo soften. Let the velvet still. There's no more need to chase novelty, or unravel old letters, or pace gilded corridors searching for feeling. There is nothing left to prove. Not to a court, not to a salon, not to the scrolling crowd inside your pocket. Now you're just here. Breathing. The candlelight of the mind flickers gently. Not out of fear, not out of exhaustion, but because it's tired of being so loud. The noise of wanting. Of needing. Of distracting. All of it drifts further away, like a gondola on still water, unmoored and quiet. This stillness is not empty. It is full of your own noticing. The creak of the ceiling. The soft buzz in your limbs. The strange comfort of being nowhere in particular. You're not in the 18th century anymore. You're not in a palace. You're not even in a story. You're just here. And that is enough. Let your mind unfold like a page unhurried. Let it write nothing tonight. Let it drift. Let it wander without needing to land. Let your body sink, soft and warm. Let your thoughts float, loose and slow. Let sleep, when it comes, find you not in panic, not in performance, but in peace. Because boredom is not the absence of life. It's the doorway into the life you've been too busy to notice. Good night.